On the morning of September 11th, 2001, the United States had no idea it was about to experience its worst attack on home soil. And in the next 102 minutes, nearly 3,000 people would be gone. But this isn't just a story about one day. It's the story of how a single terrorist plot rewrote global security forever and changed the way we live decades later. Before 8:46 in the morning, 2,977 people went to work. They hugged their families goodbye. They never came home. Firefighters rushed toward burning buildings, knowing they might not come back. Passengers on planes made final phone calls to the people they loved. And somewhere in the background, hidden in plain sight, the architects of this attack had spent months planning, training, waiting for this exact moment. The question isn't just what happened on September 11th. The question is, how did the most powerful nation in the world miss all the warning signs? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand September 11th, 2001, you have to understand the man who orchestrated it. Osama bin Laden was born in Saudi Arabia in 1957 into one of the wealthiest families in the Middle East. His father, Mohamed bin Awad bin Laden, built an empire through construction and business. But Osama didn't follow the family path of wealth and commerce. Instead, he became obsessed with religion and politics. In the 1980s, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, bin Laden saw an opportunity. He traveled to Pakistan and Afghanistan, bringing his wealth and his conviction to support the Mujahideen fighters resisting the Soviet occupation. He wasn't alone. The United States was also funding these fighters, seeing them as allies against communist expansion. But bin Laden had a different vision. He believed that Islam itself was under attack, not just by the Soviets, but by Western powers, particularly the United States. For years, he fought alongside other resistance fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan. He watched as the Soviets eventually withdrew in 1989. And when they left, he didn't go home to his wealthy family. He stayed. He planned. He built. By the late 1980s, bin Laden founded al-Qaeda, which translates to the base in English. It wasn't a typical terrorist organization with a formal structure. It was a network, a movement, a philosophy bound together by shared ideology and shared grievance. The members were former Afghan war veterans, fighters who had tasted battle and believed they were soldiers in a holy war. Bin Laden was their leader, their financier, their spiritual guide. Through the 1990s, al-Qaeda's presence grew. Cells formed in different countries. Training camps were established. And bin Laden became increasingly vocal about his hatred for the United States and the West. In 1998, he issued a fatwa, a religious edict declaring that it was the duty of every Muslim to kill Americans wherever they could be found. That same year, al-Qaeda operatives bombed the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing over 200 people. 3 years later, in October 2000, al-Qaeda struck again. A small boat loaded with explosives pulled up alongside the USS Cole, an American Navy destroyer anchored in the port of Aden in Yemen. 17 sailors died. The message was unmistakable. Al-Qaeda could reach America's military anywhere in the world. But what nobody understood at the time was that bin Laden was already planning something far more ambitious than embassy bombings or military strikes. He was planning to hit America at home in a way that would shake the nation to its core. Here's where the story becomes unbearable in its detail. The warning signs were everywhere, not hidden in classified files that would never be found. They were scattered across intelligence reports, flight school records, law enforcement observations, all across the United States. But nobody connected them. In 2000 and 2001, something peculiar started happening at flight schools across America. Foreign nationals, mostly from the Middle East, began enrolling in commercial pilot training programs. But their behavior was suspicious. They showed almost no interest in landing procedures or takeoff. They wanted to know how to operate a plane once it was airborne. Flight instructors found this strange enough to report it. In Phoenix, Arizona, an FBI agent named Kenneth Williams noticed a pattern. Multiple Middle Eastern nationals with ties to Islam were enrolled in flight schools. He became convinced this might be a coordinated effort to place operatives in cockpits. In July 2001, Williams wrote what became known as the Phoenix Memo. He sent it to FBI headquarters warning of suspicious flight training activity. But his warning was buried. It landed on desks already overwhelmed with thousands of other reports and intelligence assessments. There was no urgent response. There was no coordination. The Phoenix Memo was filed away, and the opportunity to stop what was coming slipped away. Then came another warning that should have triggered alarms. In the summer of 2001, an FBI field office in Minneapolis received a tip about a suspicious flight student named Zacharias Moussaoui. He was a French citizen of Moroccan descent who had enrolled at Pan Am International Flight Academy in Minnesota. He wanted to learn how to operate a Boeing 747, a massive commercial aircraft, but he had very limited flying experience. This was unusual. Agents who interviewed him found him evasive and hostile. One FBI agent, Colleen Rowley, became convinced that Moussaoui was involved in something serious, something dangerous. She pushed urgently for a warrant to search his apartment and his computer. But FBI leadership in Washington denied the request. They said there wasn't sufficient evidence. They said proper procedures needed to be followed. Rowley pleaded with her superiors. She told them that Moussaoui might be planning to fly a plane into a building. But nobody listened. The warrant was never issued. Moussaoui was eventually detained, but he was only arrested on immigration charges. His computer remained unsearched. The intelligence community had multiple opportunities to stop what was coming. Mohamed Atta, Marwan al-Shehhi, Hani Hanjour, Khalid al-Midhar, and Majid Banahamid. The names of the 5 hijackers were scattered across different intelligence files in different cities. They were training at flight schools in Florida, Arizona, and Minnesota. They were transferring money between accounts. They were communicating with known al-Qaeda operatives. But the information was compartmentalized. Different agencies weren't sharing what they knew. The Phoenix Memo never reached the right people. The Moussaoui warning never escalated. On August 6, 2001, President George W. Bush received a classified briefing titled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S. The briefing warned that al-Qaeda could attack American targets within the country. But no emergency alert was issued. No airports were put on high alert. No additional security measures were implemented. Time was running out. The pieces were in place. The hijackers were ready. At 7:59 on the morning of September 11, 2001, American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston Logan International Airport. It was a Boeing 767 with 92 people on board. The flight was headed to Los Angeles. At 8:13, the pilots stopped responding to air traffic control. 14 minutes later, radar controllers watched in confusion as the blip representing Flight 11 disappeared from their screens. And then, at 8:46 in the morning, the world changed. A Boeing 767 slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The impact was catastrophic. Thousands of gallons of jet fuel ignited. A massive fireball erupted from the building, visible for miles across New York City. Within minutes, news networks were broadcasting the image around the world. Television anchors and ordinary people watching at home were confused. Was it an accident? A terrible plane crash? A terrible mechanical failure? But then, at 9:03 in the morning, something else happened. United Airlines Flight 175, another Boeing 767, appeared on radar approaching New York City. Air traffic controllers tried desperately to reach the pilots. They got no response. And then they watched, helpless, as a second plane slammed directly into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. The impact was caught live on camera by dozens of news outlets. In that instant, the entire world realized this wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate attack. What happened next was organized chaos. Emergency services mobilized across New York City. Thousands of firefighters, police officers, and paramedics rushed toward the burning towers to help evacuate people and save lives. Thousands of people descended the stairwells in darkness and smoke, not knowing if they would make it to safety. Some didn't, but many did escape. They survived that terrible day. At 9:37 in the morning, as rescue operations were beginning in New York, something else was happening in Washington, D.C. American Airlines Flight 77, another Boeing 757, crashed into the Pentagon. The impact struck the western side of the building, the headquarters of the U.S. military. The explosion was catastrophic. And then, as the nation watched in horror, reports started coming in about a fourth plane. United Airlines Flight 93 had deviated from its course. It was heading toward Washington. Nobody knew where it would strike. Most of the passengers on United Airlines Flight 93 had no idea what had happened in New York or Washington when they realized something was terribly wrong. The pilots had stopped responding to air traffic control. The flight attendants reported that other crew members had been killed. The hijackers, led by Zacharias al-Hasnawi, had taken control of the cockpit. And then something remarkable happened. Some of the passengers managed to make phone calls. They learned about the attacks on the Twin Towers. They learned about the Pentagon being struck. Tom Burnett, a 38-year-old executive, called his wife Dina. He told her he loved her. And then he said something that changed everything. I know we're all going to die, but there's 3 of us that are going to do something about it. Mark Bingham, a 31-year-old sports marketing executive, called his mother Alice. He told her about the attacks. He said, I think we should do something about it. Jeremy Glick, a 31-year-old sales manager, called his wife LYZ and told her that the plane had been hijacked. He said the hijackers were talking about a bomb. Cece Lyles, a flight attendant, made calls to ground personnel. She told them the plane had been hijacked and people were wounded. The passengers didn't have weapons. They didn't have military training. They were ordinary people, a business manager, a sports marketing executive, a young Chinese immigrant named Wang Junyuan who was flying home to see his family, an older man named Jack Grancolas who had survived a car accident just weeks before and had promised his wife he would be more careful. But they made a choice. Tom Burnett said to the others on the phone, "Are you ready? Okay, let's roll." The line went dead. The transponder on Flight 93 went silent. The plane dove toward the ground. It crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, about 20 minutes' drive from Pittsburgh. All 33 passengers and 7 crew members were killed. But if they hadn't fought back, that plane would have reached Washington, D.C. Investigators believe the target was either the Capitol building or the White House. Thousands more people would have died. The passengers and crew of Flight 93 didn't know that their choice would save so many lives. They just knew they couldn't let that plane be used as a weapon. They chose to act, even knowing the cost. Tom Burnett never made it to his family reunion. Mark Bingham never made it to his mother's birthday dinner, which was scheduled for that evening. Jeremy Glick's daughter grew up without ever meeting her father. But because of their choice, thousands of other families were spared the same fate. Flight 93 became a symbol of American resilience and resistance. The phrase, "Let's roll," entered the national consciousness as a symbol of courage in the face of impossible odds. By the time Flight 93 crashed in Pennsylvania, the towers were already falling. The North Tower of the World Trade Center, struck at 8:46 in the morning, collapsed at 10:28. The South Tower, hit at 9:03, collapsed at 9:59. The buildings that had defined New York's skyline for nearly 30 years were gone. What remained was a landscape of devastation that looked like a war zone. Smoke filled the streets. Ash covered everything. First responders were still pulling people from the wreckage, but increasingly, rescue operations became recovery operations. The scale of death was almost incomprehensible. Nearly 3,000 people were dead. Hundreds more were still missing. The death toll included 343 firefighters and 71 law enforcement officers who had rushed into the buildings to help others. Families gathered at hospitals hoping their loved ones would be brought in. They waited for calls that never came. Some families spent days at missing persons centers, holding up photographs of their husbands, wives, daughters, sons, asking if anyone had seen them. The firehouse losses were devastating. Hundreds of firefighters had gone into the towers. Many never came back out. At one firehouse in Manhattan, Ladder Company 6, only 2 of the 14 firefighters who entered the tower survived. At Ladder Company 11, all but 1 firefighter who went into the towers died. Police officers, paramedics, construction workers, office workers, flight attendants, pilots, security guards, they were all gone in an instant. For families left behind, the grief was immediate and absolute. It was the kind of loss that doesn't have an ending. It reshapes your entire life forever. The people who died on September 11th came from 93 different countries. There were office workers, janitors, security guards, traders, executives. There was a blind man named Hugh Dan Walker who worked on the 91st floor. There was a pregnant woman. There were children. There were ordinary people just doing their jobs when their lives were stolen. Within hours of the attacks, the FBI and CIA mobilized every resource to identify the hijackers. The first clues came from the passenger manifests. 5 names stood out. Mohamed Atta, a 33-year-old Egyptian engineer, had been living in the United States. He had enrolled at Huffman Aviation in Florida to learn to fly a Boeing 737. He paid for the training in cash. Marwan al-Shehhi, a 23-year-old from the United Arab Emirates, had also attended flight schools in Florida. He too had paid for expensive pilot training. Hani Hanjour, a 29-year-old from Saudi Arabia, had trained at several flight schools across Arizona and Maryland. Khalid al-Midhar and Majid Mokt were also identified. But here's what made the investigation so disturbing. As federal agents began to piece together their movements, they realized something chilling. Some of these men had actually been flagged by American intelligence before the attacks. Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi had been identified by the CIA as potential operatives. The CIA knew they had attended a meeting with al-Qaeda operatives in Malaysia in January 2000. The CIA knew about this meeting, but somehow the information was never properly shared with the FBI. When al-Midhar and al-Hazmi entered the United States in January 2000, they were essentially invisible to law enforcement. Nobody stopped them. Nobody questioned them. They simply entered the country and began their preparation. Mohamed Atta coordinated the entire operation with meticulous planning. He had visited several pilot training schools, scouting locations, and understanding what kind of training he and his associates would need. He selected his team carefully. Some were experienced pilots. Others had less experience, but were assigned to roles where that mattered less. He established a cell in Florida, renting apartments, and setting up bank accounts. Money was wired to him from overseas sources, possibly from al-Qaeda leadership. He used those funds to pay for flight training at Huffman Aviation and other schools. Atta communicated with other operatives, coordinating timing and logistics. He was careful, methodical, and focused. By the summer of 2001, everything was in place. The team had received their training. They had selected their targets. They had booked their flights for September 11th, and they were ready to execute. The intelligence failures that enabled all of this became the subject of intense investigation after the attacks. The 9/11 Commission, formed in 2002 to investigate the attacks comprehensively, would eventually identify dozens of failures. Intelligence agencies weren't sharing information effectively. Bureaucratic obstacles prevented field agents from acting on warnings. The FBI and CIA had insufficient coordination. There was a general underestimation of the threat that al-Qaeda posed. The Phoenix Memo had warned about suspicious flight training activity. The warning about Zacarias Moussaoui should have triggered an alert. Information about known al-Qaeda operatives entering the country should have been flagged at the border. But none of this happened in a coordinated way. The system that was supposed to protect America had failed, and nearly 3,000 people paid the ultimate price for those failures. On the evening of September 11th, 2001, President George W. Bush addressed the nation. He stood in the Oval Office and spoke to an audience of millions who were still in shock. "Tonight," he said, "we are a nation awakened to danger and called to defend freedom. Our response must be thoughtful and measured and sure." But then he delivered a message that would define the coming years. "We will make no distinction between the terrorists and those who harbor them. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done." Within days, the military was being mobilized. Within weeks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan on October 7th, 2001, targeting al-Qaeda and the Taliban government that harbored them. The hunt for Osama bin Laden had officially begun. Thousands of American troops were deployed. The war would last 20 years. 20 years. $2 trillion would be spent. Thousands of American troops would die. Tens of thousands of Afghan civilians would lose their lives. When American forces finally withdrew in 2021, the Taliban returned to power within weeks. For many veterans and military analysts, the outcome felt like a failure. But the response to September 11th extended far beyond military action in Afghanistan. The security infrastructure of the United States was fundamentally reorganized. The Department of Homeland Security was created in 2003, consolidating multiple federal agencies under one umbrella focused on protecting the country from future terrorist attacks. The Transportation Security Administration took over airport security. Strict new procedures transformed the flying experience for everyone. Passengers who had once walked directly to their gates now had to remove their shoes, pass through metal detectors, and have their bags scanned. The entire routine of air travel changed, and it stayed changed. 2 decades later, those TSA security measures are still in place. A generation of people has grown up never knowing what it was like to fly before the TSA transformed aviation security. The National Security Agency expanded its surveillance capabilities dramatically. Programs like PRISM, which would later be exposed by whistleblower Edward Snowden, were put in place to monitor electronic communications on a massive scale. The government argued these measures were necessary to prevent another attack. But civil liberties advocates argued that the surveillance was too broad, too invasive, and violated the privacy rights that the country was supposed to be defending. A fundamental tension emerged. How much freedom are you willing to give up in order to feel safe? And that question has never been fully resolved. The military response to September 11th would define American foreign policy for the next 2 decades. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, supposedly to prevent Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein from using weapons of mass destruction. But the intelligence supporting that invasion was deeply flawed. Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction. The invasion was based partly on faulty information and partly on the broader security doctrine that emerged after September 11th. The idea that the United States should take military action against potential threats before they materialize. The Iraq War lasted years. It killed hundreds of thousands of people. It destabilized an entire region. And in many ways, it created the conditions for the rise of a new terrorist organization, ISIS, which emerged from the remnants of al-Qaeda and became one of the most brutal terrorist groups in modern history. The United States expanded its military presence globally after September 11th. Drone strikes targeted suspected terrorists in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and other countries. The government detained suspected operatives at Guantanamo Bay, a military prison in Cuba that became a symbol of the war on terror. Some detainees were tortured as part of an interrogation program that the government claimed was necessary to extract intelligence. Others were held for years without trial. But there was another consequence of the response to 9/11 that was equally devastating in its own way. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, hate crimes against Muslims in America surged dramatically. People were attacked simply because they appeared to be Muslim. Mosques were vandalized. Muslim Americans faced discrimination in employment, housing, and education. The same pattern occurred in Europe, Canada, and Australia. A religion practiced by nearly 2 billion people worldwide was being painted with the brush of terrorism because of the actions of extremists. Most Muslims condemned the attacks immediately and explicitly. Religious leaders, community organizations, and ordinary Muslims spoke out against terrorism. But in the climate of fear and anger that followed 9/11, these voices were often drowned out. The narrative became simplified and dangerous. Muslims were dangerous. Islam was incompatible with Western values. This wasn't true, but it was powerful, and it had real consequences. Entire communities were marginalized. Political movements that had been fringe before September 11th suddenly found mainstream traction. And 2 decades later, the suspicion and prejudice never fully went away. Families that had lived peacefully in America for generations suddenly felt like outsiders in their own country. 2 decades after September 11th, 2001, the attacks are often described as a historical event, something that happened and ended. But for thousands of people, the attacks never ended. They're still ongoing. First responders who rushed into the towers that day were exposed to toxic dust and debris. For years after the attacks, firefighters, construction workers, and recovery workers got sick. They developed respiratory illnesses, cancers, and other conditions. Many died. The government eventually recognized that these illnesses were directly caused by exposure to the toxic environment at Ground Zero, and compensation programs were established. But decades later, first responders are still getting sick and still dying. The health crisis among 9/11 responders is a crisis that extends across time in a way that the single day of the attacks cannot capture. Families of the victims were also dealing with ongoing grief that didn't have an expiration date. Children who lost parents on September 11th grew up without those parents. Some were infants when their fathers died. They only knew their parents through photographs and videos. Some were old enough to remember their parents, but those memories faded over time. By the 2020s, those children were adults. Some had their own children, creating a generation that would never know their grandparents because of the attacks. The grief of 9/11 became generational grief. On May 2nd, 2011, 10 years after the attacks, Osama bin Laden was finally killed in a military raid in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Navy SEAL Team 6 conducted the operation, and bin Laden was found hiding in a compound with his family. His death was celebrated in America. People gathered in the streets, relieved that the mastermind behind the attacks was finally dead. But for many people, his death brought surprisingly little closure. Bin Laden had been in hiding for 10 years, already removed from daily operations of al-Qaeda. His death didn't end terrorism. It didn't undo the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It didn't change the surveillance systems that had been put in place. It didn't bring back the people who had died. It was closure of a kind, but a hollow one. Al-Qaeda continued to operate. ISIS emerged and became even more brutal than al-Qaeda. Terrorism didn't end. The war on terror, which was launched after September 11th to defeat terrorism, continued. By 2020, people were asking, has the war on terror even been won? Was it ever winnable? The 9/11 Commission report, released in 2004, contained over 500 pages of findings about the intelligence failures that led to the attacks. It identified systemic problems in how government agencies communicated, how intelligence was analyzed, and how threats were assessed. The report made dozens of recommendations for reform. Some were implemented, others were not. The intelligence community made changes, but debates continue about whether those changes were effective and whether they went too far in expanding government surveillance powers. September 11th, 2001, taught America something uncomfortable but true. Systems fail. Even well-intentioned systems built by intelligent people can fail to see threats developing in plain sight. The intelligence community is staffed by dedicated professionals who work every day to keep the country safe. But they're also human. They make mistakes. They miss things. And when those failures intersect with a coordinated, determined adversary, the consequences can be catastrophic. Looking back 23 years later, we're still asking hard questions. Did the world become safer because of the response to 9/11? Or have we simply traded one set of fears for another? These are questions without easy answers. But they matter because they shape how we understand our own security and our own freedom. The attacks of September 11th didn't end on September 11th, 2001. Their ripples continue to define our world.